Someone checked in upstairs and never came back down. Welcome to the Whimsy Casebook. I am your host, Morgan Finch. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Your voice adds something special to every case we tell. Let's begin. It was the smell that brought back the memory. Not a sharp memory, but something shapeless and quiet, like the way one remembers a room one only visited once. A yeasty scent drifted in from the kitchen, mixed with damp wool and yesterday's tobacco smoke. Maigret sat by the window of his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, the glass fogged just enough to blur the wet street lamps below. He had a newspaper folded neatly in his lap, unread. Madame Maigret, in her soft slippers, passed behind him without a word. She was already in her dressing gown, the kettle humming in the other room. Outside it was a Thursday, around 8. In the evening, too late for work, too early for sleep, and the kind of evening that held nothing in particular, which Maigret had come to appreciate. He lit his pipe. The phone did not ring. It hadn't for 3 days, in fact. The last case had closed quietly. A burglary with a drunken confession, no mystery to prod at. And while the other men at the Quai des Orfèvres often found such lulls maddening, Maigret found them necessary. They let the dust settle, gave people time to forget he was a policeman. But even in silence, something always stirred. That night, it was a letter. A thin envelope had arrived by post that morning, handwritten in a careful, cramped style. Not from a lawyer, not an official matter, just a woman's name he didn't know, and a return address in the 18th arrondissement. Rue Custine. He hadn't opened it until after lunch, and even then only out of idle curiosity. The contents were unremarkable. A woman named Jeanne Godet, who owned a small café in Montmartre, wrote that something was wrong. She didn't say what, only that she was worried about the lodger upstairs and that people aren't made to live like that. She asked, not demanded, if Maigret might pass by, if he had the time. It was signed simply, Jeanne, Garde Café du Midi, Rue Custine, that was all. No mention of a crime, no accusations. And yet, Maigret had placed the letter beside his tobacco tin instead of tossing it. There was something about the phrasing, people aren't made to live like that. What did she mean by that? Poverty, illness, guilt. Should I leave? The kettle on? Madame Maigret asked from the doorway. No, chérie, he said gently. I might step out for a bit. I'll be back before midnight. She nodded, as if she already knew. After so many years, she recognized that tone, the one where his curiosity had already taken the first few steps ahead of him. He rose, buttoned his overcoat, and tucked the letter into the pocket where his hand always rested, beside his matches, and pipe. He didn't take his revolver. He never did unless someone told him to. It was still raining when he reached the foot of Rue Custine, a fine, misty rain that turned the cobblestones slick and blurred the gaslight halos. The café was easy to find, not because it stood out, but because it didn't. It was the sort of place you wouldn't remember walking past twice. Yellowing curtains, a green awning faded at the edges, and windows that hadn't been wiped down that week. Inside, a small bell above the door gave a tired chime. The place was nearly empty, just 2 men hunched at the counter, nursing glasses of pastis. A middle-aged woman stood behind the bar, drying glasses with slow, practiced movements. She looked up without surprise as he entered, and without asking, poured a coffee into a thick porcelain cup and placed it before him on the counter. "You came," she said simply. Maigret nodded and warmed his hands around the cup. The heat crept into his fingers, and for a moment he said nothing. He looked around. The air smelled of stale beer and boiled ham. There were lace doilies under the liquor bottles, a calendar still turned to May, and the sound of something dripping somewhere behind the counter. "What made you write?" he asked finally, not looking at her. She wiped her hands and leaned, slightly forward. "I'm not sure, maybe I shouldn't have, it's just something about him isn't right." "The lodger?" "Yes. He's been renting the room above the cafe for 6 weeks. Quiet man. Always pays on time. Never. Makes a mess, but I don't know if he sleeps. He comes in late, eats very little, doesn't answer when I knock. And then there's the smell." Maigret raised an eyebrow slightly. "A strange smell," she said, frowning. "Not like anything rotten. Something dry. Old. Like paper and soap, maybe. It clings to the air. I can't explain it. But I keep thinking he's hiding something up there. What's his name? Villet, that's all he gave, Jean Villet. No profession, no mail, no visitors." Maigret took a sip of his coffee, slow and thoughtful. The name meant nothing, but that wasn't unusual. People rarely introduced themselves honestly to landlords. "Have you spoken to him?" She shook her head. "He answers in short sentences, smiles politely, but he doesn't. See you, you know. He looks past you." The two men at the bar paid their tab and left. Jean Godet glanced toward the staircase behind the cafe. The wallpaper along the stairwell was peeling in one corner, revealing a brownish underlayer, and the light bulb above flickered faintly. "I'm not asking you to arrest him," she said, almost embarrassed. I've been running this place 22 years. I know when someone's only pretending to be ordinary." That, Maigret thought, was perhaps the only truly useful kind of experience. He finished his coffee and stood. She didn't stop him when he turned toward the stairs. "3rd floor," she said. "End of the hall. I haven't been up there in 2 days." He gave a slight nod and climbed the stairs slowly, his hand sliding along the banister, his pipe still in his coat pocket, unlit. The building was quiet, too quiet for a place where someone lived. Each step echoed slightly, softened only by the worn carpet underfoot. At the landing, he stood for a moment. The hallway smelled faintly of boiled onions and something else. Something dry and metallic, like coins kept too long in a damp pocket. The door to the last room on the left was closed. There was no sound behind it. Maigret did not knock, not yet. He just stood there, listening. And the silence, too perfect, began to suggest its own kind of noise. The silence behind the door had a texture to it, not the peaceful kind found in empty countryside chapels, but something tighter, a quiet that seemed to press inward on itself. Maigret stood for another moment, letting his weight settle evenly on the floorboards, the soft creak of old wood beneath his shoes sounding louder than expected. He raised a knuckle and tapped, once, then twice. No answer. He waited. Not for a sound, but for a shift in feeling. The kind Maigret trusted more than any noise, the tension of a presence, the small changes in air when someone holds their breath on the other side of a thin partition. Still, nothing. He tapped once more, just a touch firmer. This time, footsteps approached, measured, light, like someone who wasn't surprised but was deciding whether to respond. A pause. Then the metallic click of a lock turning and the door opened halfway. A man appeared, not young, not old. Somewhere in the vast middle space where most men live, unnoticed. Pale, thin-faced, with the kind of receding hairline that didn't come from age but from anxiety. He wore a brown cardigan over a button shirt, no tie, and slippers instead of shoes. His expression was blank, not startled, not annoyed, just expectant. "Yes," he said. Maigret didn't identify himself as a policeman. He rarely did unless asked. It ruined too much of what people naturally offered in the moments before they started guarding their words. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said calmly, "but Madame Godet asked me to check in. She said you weren't feeling well." The man blinked slowly. "Madame Godet worries too much. I've simply been working late." He had a voice like faint chalk, the kind that scratched softly on the air. Not defensive, but practiced. Too practiced. Maigret gave a small nod, looking just past the man's shoulder into the room beyond. It was dimly lit, though a small lamp sat on a desk near the window. Books were stacked neatly beside it, not casual piles, but arranged deliberately by size. A bed in the corner, covered with a brown wool blanket, a wardrobe, no photographs, no color. "May I?" Maigret asked, motioning slightly toward the room. Villers hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course." Maigret entered. The carpet was worn thin in a line from the bed to the desk. The air smelled faintly of camphor and old tobacco, the kind not smoked recently but lingering from years ago. There were no clothes on hooks, no shoes by the bed. The wardrobe was closed tight. On the desk, an inkwell and fountain pen stood, at attention beside a lined notebook. "Do you write?" Maigret asked, motioning to the desk. Villers gave a faint smile. "I try." "What kind of writing?" "Observations, notes on people, essays perhaps. Nothing serious." Maigret turned slightly, facing the man. "You were here during the storm Tuesday night?" "Yes, and the night before." "I don't go out much. I've been unwell." His hands were clasped loosely behind his back. Maigret noticed they were clean. Too clean. "Has anyone visited you recently?" "No one." Maigret let the silence stretch a moment longer. Then he turned to the window. It faced a narrow courtyard just wide enough for a cat to walk across. He imagined the room at night, sealed off from noise, from people, from time. "You live quietly." "I prefer it that way." "Your name is Jean Villers?" "That's right." Maigret walked over to the small wastebasket beneath the desk. Empty, except for a crumpled cigarette package. Foreign, Belgian. Not recent. He made no comment. "I'll let Madame Godet know you're all right," he said at last. "She worries. You might try being seen more often." "I'll try." Maigret gave a faint nod and stepped out. He paused in the hallway, as if to listen again. No sound followed, just the door closing softly behind him and the faint click of the lock sliding back into place. He descended slowly, one hand brushing the wooden rail. Back in the café, Jean Godet was wiping down the counter with unnecessary energy. "Well?" "He's quiet, as you said, polite, tense." "I knew it." "Did he ever mention family?" "No. Never even said where he came from. I asked once. He said, 'Nowhere worth remembering.'" Maigret lit his pipe now. He let the first draw sit on his tongue. There was no crime, no body, no missing persons report. But there was something nonetheless, something slightly off. "Have you noticed anything strange lately? Any visitors, anything missing?" "No, nothing like that, except—" She hesitated. "Yes?" "I thought I heard a voice the other night. Not his. Someone else upstairs. Around 1 or 2. In the morning. But when I went up a few hours later to change the linen outside his door, there was no one there." Maigret tapped the edge of his pipe against the counter. "Do you have his registration card?" "Of course." She went behind the till and produced a folded slip, one of the blue forms required by law. Handwritten in firm strokes, nom. Jean Villers profession, independent writer, date of birth, 14th of March, 1894. Place of birth, La Louvière, Belgium. Nationality, Belgian. Last residence, not listed, A Belgian. That explained the cigarette pack. But Maigret didn't recall seeing a Belgian passport. He flipped the card over. No official stamp from the local prefecture. Likely not submitted. "Thank you," he said, and tucked the form into his coat pocket. He didn't leave the café at once. Instead, he sat again by the window and watched the street. The rain had settled into a dull mist. A girl with a red umbrella crossed toward the metro, her steps fast and nervous. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then was quiet. Jean Godet brought him another coffee without asking. It steamed faintly. The cup clinked as she set it down. "What is it, Inspector?" "I'm not sure yet," he said, "but I think he's waiting for something." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "He's arranged his life too neatly, as if preparing for someone. Someone who never arrived, or someone who did, and left without being noticed." She crossed her arms, unsettled. "You'll come back?" she asked after a moment. Maigret nodded, more to himself than to her. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "before the café opens." As he stepped back into the wet evening, the light from the café spilled behind him across the pavement, golden and thin. He didn't take the metro. He walked. Past shuttered storefronts and the occasional passing bicycle, through the damp and quiet hush of Paris at night. The rain clung to his coat like a memory. And above him, somewhere behind that shuttered window on the third floor, the man called Villas no doubt sat again at his desk, perhaps writing, perhaps listening, behind a locked door and a silence. That was beginning to feel less like solitude and more like a secret. Maigret arrived at the café just before 7. The street was still waking. A milkman's cart clattered by on Rue Custine, its wheels leaving thin, wet tracks. In the distance, a baker's chimney exhaled white ribbons of floury smoke into the air. He paused outside the café, watching the metal shutter halfway up, and could see Jean Godet inside, sweeping behind the counter with the resigned air of someone who had done the same movement for years. She noticed him and unlocked the door without a word. "Coffee?" she asked, setting the broom aside. He nodded, removing his hat and wiping the rain from the brim. It was not raining anymore, but the air was heavy, sodden with last night's mist. He took the same stool as the evening before, his coat still damp at the seams. Jean placed the steaming cup before him and sat across from him, clasping her hands together. "He hasn't come down," she said. "He's an early riser. Usually, or at least I hear him moving by now." Maigret sipped. The coffee was bitter, strong. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he asked, "Did you notice when he last left the building?" She frowned, thinking. "Not since Monday night, I don't think. No one's come looking for him either. Not since you visited." Maigret removed the registration form from his coat pocket and placed it on the counter. The handwriting struck him again. It wasn't messy but overly deliberate, the kind of handwriting people used when they were trying to look calm. "You said you heard a voice. Could it have been the radio or from the street?" "No, it was close, right above, a low voice, not arguing, just speaking. Like someone reading aloud, almost." "You didn't go up?" "No, I didn't want to intrude." Maigret lit his pipe, shielding the flame with his palm. It sputtered slightly from the damp. He let the silence stretch again, not as a tactic, but because it was his nature to think slowly and not fill the air unnecessarily. It allowed space for details to breathe. "Does the room next to his have a tenant?" "Not at the moment. It's empty." "Could I see it?" Jeanne blinked but nodded. She took a ring of keys from under the register and led him through the side corridor and up the narrow stairs once more. The second-floor hallway smelled faintly of floor polish and boiled water. At the top landing, she opened the door to the adjacent room. It was bare. A worn mattress, a chair, a dusty mirror. The curtains were drawn. Maigret walked in slowly and stepped over to the shared wall between this room and Villers. He stood there for a moment, hand resting lightly on the plaster. The wall was thin, he could hear nothing through it now. But then again, the silence itself was telling. "Madame Godet," he said, "could you go downstairs? I'd like to knock at his door again." She nodded and retreated without fuss. Maigret waited until her steps disappeared below, then crossed the hall to the door of Villers' room. He knocked, softly at first. No answer. He knocked again, more firmly. Still silence. He tried the handle. Locked. That too was unusual. People in rooms above cafés rarely locked their doors from inside. There was nothing to steal but silence. He went downstairs and asked Jeanne for the master key. "You're going in?" she asked, her voice tight. "Yes, I think we should." She handed over the brass key with a slight tremble in her fingers. When he returned to the third floor, he hesitated briefly before inserting the key. The lock turned smoothly, too smoothly, as if recently oiled. He pushed the door open. The room was unchanged in its arrangement. Nothing was out of place. The brown blanket on the bed was smoothed, the notebook still on the desk. A pair of slippers neatly aligned beneath the chair. And yet something was wrong. The air was wrong, not foul, not the unmistakable stench of decay, but stale in another way, as though the room had stopped breathing. He crossed to the desk and opened the notebook. The last page was half filled with short lines, more poetic than factual. Observations. Rain again tonight. The girl with the red umbrella returns, always alone. Silence from the café, except the voice of Jeanne, familiar. Regret has no weight, but it presses all the same. Then the final line just below the others. He knocked. I opened. Maigret looked up, blinking slowly. He turned and checked the wardrobe. Empty. The wastebasket, the same discarded cigarette box, untouched. The bed had not been slept in. The lamp's bulb was still warm when he touched it. He moved to the window. It was closed, latched from inside. The view into the narrow courtyard was the same. Blank stone walls, grey and damp, no ledge large enough to stand on. No sign of Villers. No clothes, no toiletries, no wallet, no passport. Maigret closed the notebook and turned slowly in place, taking in the whole room again. It felt less like someone had left, and more like someone had been erased. He returned to the café and placed the notebook carefully on the counter. "He's not there," he said. Jean stared at him. "Not there." No clothes, no trace, nothing, just this. He opened the notebook to the last page. She read the final entry, her brow furrowed. "But that was after you visited. He wrote about you." Maigret nodded slowly. "Which means he was still here late last night. But then, where did he go? That's what I intend to find out." He tucked the notebook under his arm. He needed to verify the handwriting, the origin of the registration slip, the Belgian address. If it was real, he would send a note to the Belgian police. Perhaps they had someone missing, or perhaps they didn't. Perhaps Villers never existed, at all in official terms, but Maigret had seen him, heard him speak, watched him hesitate. That was real enough. He rose and put on his hat. "Don't change the room," he said to Jeanne. "Don't clean. Don't touch anything." She nodded. As he left the café once more, the mist had lifted slightly. The sky was still overcast, but brighter. He walked slowly back toward the station, pipe clenched between his teeth. Not with urgency, but with that quiet, patient gravity that always accompanied the beginning of something deeper than it first appeared. And somewhere a man named Villers, or someone who had chosen that name, was missing without ever having truly arrived. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the halls smelled of wet coats and stale ink, as they always did after rain. Maigret walked, with his usual unhurried steps through the main corridor, nodding to the sergeant at the front desk, who barely looked up from his paperwork. It was still early, and the building had that peculiar stillness before a full day's bustle. The echo of footsteps across tile, the distant tapping of typewriter keys, the soft murmur of a phone ringing unanswered 2 offices away. Maigret climbed the stairs to his office, a narrow space with dark wooden filing cabinets, 2 armchairs worn at the arms, and a metal coat rack that had once stood in his predecessor's apartment. He hung his coat and hat and placed the notebook from Villa's room on his desk. He sat down and read it again, line by line. The final entries were brief, reflective, nearly poetic, but impersonal, as if Villers had written them not for himself, but for someone who might find them. Regret has no weight, but it presses all the same. Maigret closed the notebook and reached for the telephone. He asked the switchboard to connect him to the Belgian police in La Louvière. While he waited, he pulled the registration slip back out of his coat and studied it again. There was something too even in the script, the kind of handwriting that tried to avoid leaving any personality behind. A click on the line. A voice answered in accented French. "This is Chief Inspector Maigret, from Paris," he said. "I'm calling about a man named Jean Villers. Registered himself as born 14th of March 1894 in La Louvière, writer staying in Montmartre. I'd appreciate if you could check your civil registry and let me know if the name matches anything." The officer on the other end, polite but somewhat sleepy, promised to call back within the hour. Maigret thanked him and hung up. He then walked down the hall to the records department and handed the notebook to Madame Lapointe, a quiet, thin-lipped woman whose spectacles were perpetually smudged. She gave the object a perfunctory glance before opening the cover. "I'd like a handwriting comparison," Maigret said. "See if we've had any reports or background files where this hand appears, letters, witness statements, anything. Also, check hotel registrations for the name Villers past 3 months within the city." She gave a small nod and took the notebook without asking questions. Maigret appreciated that. Some officers filled the air with chatter. Madame Lapointe let silence do its work. Back in his office, he filled his pipe, though he didn't light it. Instead, he sat by the window and watched the Seine below. A garbage barge passed slowly, its operator hunched against the morning chill. Across the river, people moved in that slow, purposeful rhythm of ordinary life. Market vendors unloading crates, schoolchildren tugging on their mothers' sleeves, policemen on bicycles gliding past cafés. There was something oddly weightless about the man called Villers. He had left behind no trail, no belongings, no friends or enemies. And yet, in Maigret's memory, the man's presence remained vivid. Not dramatic, but specific. The way he had stood with his hands behind his back, the faint chalk in his voice, the expressionless politeness like someone waiting in line for a train that would never come. A knock at the door. It opened to reveal Inspector Lognon, looking as he always did, slightly hunched, hair thinning, coat too loose at the collar, as though life had always been half a size too big for him. "You're in early," Lognon muttered. Maigret gestured toward the chair without rising. "Sit down, I have something odd." "Odd how?" "No crime exactly. A disappearance. Or maybe just an erasure." Lognon sat with a sigh and listened as Maigret described the man in the café room, the letter from Madame Godet, the quiet behavior and the sudden vanishing. "And no one saw him leave?" Lognon asked. "No, and the door was locked from the inside." Lognon scratched his neck. "Suicide?" "No body." No smell, nothing disturbed. If he left carefully and invisibly. Maybe he just moved on. Writers are like that. Maigret allowed a faint smile. That's the trouble, Lognon. Most people leave shadows when they move. Debts, friends, a last meal on the stove. This man left a made bed and a notebook with no fingerprints. Lognon grunted. You think it's an alias? I think it's more than that. I think it's someone who wanted to disappear. But why live above a cafe if you want to vanish? Because cafes are noisy, forgettable. You see 100 people a day, and none of them stay. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the corridor outside filtering in, a young officer laughing too loud, the rattle of a tea cart. Then the phone rang. Maigret picked it up. It was the Belgian police. There's no record of a Jean Villers born in La Louvière in 1894, the officer reported, nor in neighboring communes. We checked our census records and consular registrations as well. The name is clean, possibly invented. Maigret thanked them and hung up. So we know this much, he said to Lognon. Whoever he was, he didn't want to be found, but something kept him there. Something made him stay 6 weeks in the Pite. Same small room. Lognon stood. Want me to check surrounding cafes, see if anyone's seen him? Start there, and ask if anyone remembers him visiting during the day, or being followed. Followed? Maigret nodded slowly. It's a theory. Jean heard a second voice. Lognon hesitated, then left. Maigret rose and walked to the filing cabinet. He pulled open the drawer marked Unsolved Montmartre. Thin files, petty thefts, one assault, a missing schoolteacher. None seemed connected. He flipped through slowly, not expecting a match, but reading each name with care. At noon, Madame Lapointe returned with the notebook. No direct matches, she said. But the handwriting style, slanted left, slow vertical pressure, formal rhythm, it's not spontaneous. Could be someone used to copying or transcribing, possibly clerical work or espionage. Maigret raised his eyebrows. It's not proof, she said quickly. Only texture. He thanked her and returned to his desk. Espionage. He didn't like that word. Too large, too cinematic. Maigret preferred crimes of jealousy, fear, and fatigue. The old motives. The quiet ones. But he had to admit, the absence of fingerprints, the Belgian cigarette box, the empty wardrobe, it all suggested a person used to avoiding traces. He lit his pipe at last and leaned back. Who are you, Villers? Or who were you pretending to? Charity, by the time Maigret returned to Rue Custine that afternoon, the sky had brightened slightly, though it retained the dull hue of tarnished pewter. The pavement glistened with the day's slow drying. Children were skipping rope near the corner, and the air smelled faintly of wet newspaper and frying onions from a distant kitchen window. Inside the Café du Midi, the mood was much the same. A few neighborhood regulars nursed small glasses of white wine or coffee, some reading the evening edition, others merely staring at the walls with the expressionless patience of men who'd already said all they intended to say. Jean Godet greeted Maigret with a tight-lipped nod and motioned silently toward the rear stairwell. He didn't go up at once. Instead, he stood at the counter, slowly stirring a sugar cube into his coffee. He studied her profile as she dried a glass with the same cloth she'd likely used all morning. "You didn't hear anything else since I left?" he asked. "No, but I don't like the quiet up there." She looked up now, meeting his eyes. "Sometimes a silence is louder than footsteps." Maigret nodded. "Has anyone asked about him since I first came?" "No, but a man did come in around noon. Didn't stay long. Ordered mineral water. Looked around more than he drank." "Describe him." Hard to say, mid-40s, plain coat, narrow face, small eyes. He wore gloves, though it wasn't cold enough for them. That's unusual. I thought so too. He left quickly. Didn't touch his glass. Did he look up the stairs? She nodded. Maigret felt a stir of something faint but familiar. Not fear, not urgency, but the thin current of pressure that moved through a case when it shifted from idle puzzle to living tension. He went up. The door to Villa's room remained closed. The key still fit smoothly in the lock. Inside, the air had changed again, no longer musty but aired out slightly, as though someone had opened the window and shut it again not long after. The first thing Maigret noticed was the ashtray. It had been empty the day before. Now it contained a single stub of a cigarette, not the Belgian brand from before, but a Gauloise, smoked down to the filter. A faint trace of lipstick marked the edge. He picked it up carefully with a handkerchief and placed it on the desk. Nearby something else caught his eye, tucked beneath the notebook. A postcard. It had not been there yesterday. He was certain. The image was of a canal in Bruges, calm water, a stone bridge, a row of shuttered houses reflected in the glassy surface, the kind of tourist image that could be bought for 10 francs in any station kiosk. But the back of it was blank, no stamp, no message, no name. He held it up to the light, the faintest impression, barely visible, as though someone had begun to write and then changed their mind. He moved to the desk, opened the top drawer. Inside were more postcards, 3 or 4 of the same kind, identical views of the same Bruges canal, all blank, all untouched. Maigret sat in the single chair, resting his elbows on the desk. What sort of man collected blank postcards from a single city, kept them hidden in a drawer, and left no other paper trail behind? He checked the wastebasket again. Nothing new. No food wrappers, no receipts, no envelopes. He opened the wardrobe. Still empty. But this time he examined the base, lifting a fold of the thin carpet lining. Tucked beneath the wooden slats, flat and carefully placed, was a folded sheet of heavy paper, old hotel stationery from a small pension in Liège, Pension Saint-Antoine, Rue des Tanneries, 14, Liège. The sheet was blank except for a name written at the top in the same hand as the notebook. R. Mertens, not Villas. Maigret folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his coat. Back downstairs, Jeanne looked up expectantly. He left something behind, Maigret said. A name. Possibly a real one. He showed her the paper. She shook her head. That name means nothing to me, nor to me, but I think we'll learn something from it. He didn't stay for another coffee. Instead, he walked the 2 blocks to a corner post office with a telephone booth and made another call. Time to the Liège police, requesting a check on the pension. He described the name, the image, the date range. While waiting, he stepped outside and leaned against the stone facade, watching the rhythm of life move on. A delivery boy cycled past. A man in a grey suit paced while smoking, waiting for something, or someone. A few minutes later, the post office attendant waved to him through the glass. Maigret returned to the booth and picked up the receiver. The Belgian officer, this time brisker in tone, reported, "The Pension Saint-Antoine is real, still operational. We checked their guest registry. No R. Mertens registered under that name. But, and this is interesting, a man using the A name Jean Villers did stay there in early March. Arrived alone, stayed 5 nights, paid in cash. Was he Belgian? No papers submitted. The staff remembered him vaguely, quiet, asked few questions, wrote postcards each morning. Postcards? Yes, all to the same address. One of them still had the address on file, 28, Rue des Martyrs, Paris. Maigret repeated the address aloud. It was in the 9th arrondissement, not far from Pigalle. He thanked the officer and hung up. As he walked back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, pipe tucked between his teeth, Maigret felt the landscape of the case begin to shift, not widen, but deepen. The man called Villers had gone to Liège, stayed in anonymity, written daily postcards, to a Parisian address, and then returned to Montmartre, where he had vanished without ever truly being found. Now he had a second name, a place, a destination, and perhaps at last a thread that would hold. The building at 28, Rue des Martyrs, was unremarkable. 5 floors of soot-colored stone with faded wooden shutters, a narrow entrance framed by iron railings, and a dull brass plate that listed its tenants in smudged lettering. It was the kind of place Maigret had seen 1,000 times across Paris. Not poor, not affluent, but respectable in that threadbare way which suggested tenants who had lived there too long to leave and too quietly to be noticed. He pushed through the heavy glass door and found the concierge's window just beyond the vestibule. A small electric heater buzzed behind the glass, beside a bowl of hard candies and a thin paperback detective novel with a broken spine. They say concierge, a short, round-shouldered woman with silvered hair, glanced up with the wary look of someone used to avoiding involvement. Maigret showed his identification without flourish. Chief Inspector Maigret. I'm trying to locate someone who may have received mail here recently. Would you have a moment? She blinked slowly, adjusting her glasses. There hasn't been trouble, has there? Not exactly. I'm simply tracing a trail. Do you have a resident at this address by the name of R. Mertens? She thought for a moment, then reached for a dog-eared ledger and began flipping pages. Mertens. Yes. Madame Mertens. 3rd floor. Left. Widow. Been here about 4 years. Quiet woman. Does she live alone? Yes. Never seen anyone visit more than once or twice. Keeps to herself. Pays her rent early. Maigret nodded. And mail? Has she received any postcards recently? The concierge looked mildly surprised. Every week, I think, for the last couple of months. Always the same sort. Glossy, foreign views. Bruges, Ghent, Antwerp. She never talks about them. Do you recall when the last one came? 2 days ago. I took it up myself. Maigret thanked her and climbed the stairs, which groaned softly beneath his feet. The building had a smell he knew well, old varnish, boiled cabbage, and something faintly medicinal that clung to the walls like history. He reached the 3rd floor and paused before the door on the left. It bore no nameplate, just the number, 3B. He knocked twice. A moment passed, then the soft shuffle of slippers. The door opened a fraction. The woman behind it was in her 60s, slender, with hair that had once been black and was now an elegant grey. She wore a knitted shawl over a dark blouse and had the kind of posture that suggested she once moved through rooms with purpose, though time had slowed her. Yes? Madame Mertens? Yes. He introduced himself again, gently this time. I'd like to speak with you about someone who may have been writing to you from Belgium, someone who called himself Jean Villers. The woman's face did not change, not in expression, not even in the small reflexive ways. No twitch of the eye, no movement of the mouth. She opened the door wider and stepped aside. You'd better come in. The apartment was tidy, almost Spartan. A single armchair near the window, a polished table with 2 chairs, a sideboard with a framed photo of a young man in uniform. No radio, no telephone, just silence and order. She motioned for him to sit, then lowered herself into the armchair. He's dead, isn't he? She asked. Maigret studied her. No, not that I know of, but he's missing, and the more I look, the less I know who he really was. She gave a small, breathless laugh. Then we have something in common. Maigret let the silence rest between them. "When did you last hear from him?" he asked finally. "Tuesday. A postcard, as always." "Always from Bruges?" "Yes. Different photos, but the same message every time." "Which was?" She stood, crossed to the sideboard, and retrieved a bundle held together with a blue ribbon. She handed it to him. Maigret untied it and leafed through the cards. Each one bore a date, always marked in careful script, and a short line. "Still." Watching the water, thinking of our walk. "Nothing more postmarked from Belgium, always the same neat hand. Did you ever reply?" "No, he didn't leave a return address, only the postmark." "Did you know him as Jean Villers?" "No," she said softly. "I knew him as René Mertens, my husband's younger brother." Maigret leaned back slightly, pipe still unlit in his coat. "You hadn't seen him in some time?" "Not since the funeral. My husband passed 4 years ago. René came briefly, then disappeared again. He always drifted. Brussels, Lyon, Düsseldorf once. He never stayed anywhere long, never married. He was the sort of man who couldn't live in bright rooms." Maigret nodded slowly. "Do you know what he did for work?" "Something in translation, technical manuals, I believe. But I never really asked. René was not a man you questioned too much. You might find him gone by morning." He handed back the bundle of postcards. "Madame, has anyone else ever asked about him?" "Visited. Telephoned." She shook her head. "I thought I'd never hear from him again." Then, out of nowhere, the cards began arriving, one each week, as if he wanted me to know he was alive and but nothing more. Maigret stood. "Thank you for your time." She walked him to the door. "If you do find him," she said quietly, "don't tell him I kept the cards. He might stop writing." He gave a small smile and tipped his hat. Back on the street the wind had picked up. The sky was growing darker again, as if the city had briefly tried to dry its coat before succumbing once more to the damp. He lit his pipe and walked without hurrying. Now he knew the name was real. Mertens. A man who drifted, who left only vague prints on paper, and who wrote to a woman he had once called family, not to confess but to be remembered. What he didn't know yet was who had smoked the cigarette in his room, or who had come after him, and why. The next morning, Maigret arrived again at the Quai des Orfèvres with the feeling that the investigation, if one could call it that, had passed a point of quiet curiosity and entered something heavier, something more human and inevitable. He no longer wondered whether something had happened to René Mertens, known also as Jean Villers. He felt it in his bones. It wasn't deduction, not yet. But something colder, the absence of presence as palpable as a chair still warm after its occupant has fled. At his desk he found 2 notes waiting, the first from Lognon, who had canvassed the streets around Rue Custine the day before. It was brief, no sightings of Villers. One shopkeeper remembers him buying a newspaper, always alone, never lingered. The second note, however, was more intriguing. From Inspector Maigret, Vice Squad Subject, Gloved Man near Rue Custine. Time 12:10 p.m. day before yesterday. Details civilian report of man loitering near Café du Midi. Wore gloves, did not enter any shops. Brief encounter with woman at bakery. No purchase made. Watched window of Café. Left heading north toward Place Jules Joffrin. Maigret reread the note twice. So Jeanne had not imagined the man, and he had not only been present, he had waited, observed, perhaps even followed. The gloves again, unseasonable, unnecessary, unless of course they served a different function. Gloves didn't only protect from cold, they also kept fingerprints off doorknobs, banisters, glassware. He folded the note and placed it carefully in the left drawer of his desk. Then, after a short pause, he walked to the main archives. There, he requested a review of known associates of Merton's, not expecting much, but hoping the man had once, even fleetingly, brushed shoulders with the police in Belgium or France. But the file came back thin, barely a file at all, no priors. One mention in a customs entry from 1946, travelling from Düsseldorf to Brussels, profession listed as interpreter. Do we have anything on foreign nationals under surveillance? In the Montmartre district, he asked a young lieutenant who had just come off night duty. The man yawned and rubbed his eyes. You mean recently? Yes. The lieutenant checked the list. We had a watch on a man named Leclerc, Belgian-born, mild communist affiliations, suspected to have been running small errands for someone across the border. Nothing major. He's disappeared, though. When? 3 days ago, the day before the Café du Midi called in. Maigret narrowed his eyes. Disappeared how? Stopped showing up at his usual haunts. A landlady said he packed up in the night, left no forwarding address, took everything but a broken umbrella. Maigret thought for a moment. Was he known to wear gloves? The lieutenant blinked. Actually, yes. Black leather, year-round. A few hours later, Maigret was back in Montmartre. The streets were busier now, it was market day, but the atmosphere was still that of an old city growing ever more tired of its own stories. Bread wagons and murmuring shoppers, noisy pigeons in the square. Yet the Café du Midi remained. A still point in the haze, its green awning faded as ever, its curtains drawn halfway against the light. Inside, Jeanne Gaudet was at her post, polishing glasses that didn't need polishing. She looked up the moment he entered. You've heard something, she said. Maigret gave a small nod. There may have been someone watching. A man in gloves. He came back more than once. Her hands froze mid-polish. I knew it. Describe again what you heard that night, the night before I came. She sat slowly behind the counter. It was around 1. I'd gone up briefly, just to check the taps in the kitchen. That's when I thought I heard voices. 2, maybe 3 words, nothing distinct. Then a chair scraped. Then nothing. And since then, no sounds. Just that. Feeling that something's been finished. He stood, his pipe between his fingers but unlit. Show me again the path to the 3rd floor. She led him back through the corridor. They passed the stairwell, quiet now, dust gathering along. The baseboards. He stopped midway between the 2nd and 3rd floors. Do you mind if I try something? Go ahead. He crouched and touched the wooden steps lightly. Then, one by one, he ran his fingers along the edge of the risers. Halfway up, just before the top landing, he found it. A faint smear. Along the wall panel. Oil, not much, but human, and recently transferred. He stood and looked back toward Jeanne. Someone waited here, he said, before going up, and someone else may have come down before dawn. She said nothing, but her expression turned inward. Back in Villas, Merton's room, Maigret searched again, but with different eyes now, not for who the man had been, but what the man had brought with him. He examined the legs of the desk, the corners of the carpet, the frame of the bed. It was near the baseboard that he found the matchbook, plain cardboard unmarked, only 3 matches remained, and tucked inside, barely legible beneath the torn cover, were the faint remains of a handwritten number. 72, 44, 13, 19. He pocketed it carefully. Later that afternoon in his office, he dialed the number through internal communications. It rang 5 times before a voice answered. Institut Maritime, booking and registration. Maigret said nothing at first. Then he spoke quietly. Do you have a registry under the name Leclerc or Villers, or Mertens? The woman on the other end hesitated. Yes, Leclerc booked a single berth, left yesterday. Destination? Antwerp. He thanked her and replaced the receiver slowly. So the gloved man had left, or someone using his name had. But what stayed with Maigret, and what tugged harder than the trail of any ship, was not the escape. It was the silence that followed. Because something about the room above the café, the quietness of it, the order, the postcard, the lipstick on the cigarette, still spoke of another presence. Not Leclerc, not Mertens, someone who hadn't gone to sea, someone still in Paris and waiting. It was late afternoon when Maigret returned once more to the Café du Midi. A light drizzle had begun to fall again, soft and insistent, as though Paris were reluctant to dry completely. The streets shimmered beneath the diffused light, and each step Maigret took felt muffled, cushioned by the wet stone and the weight of a question that refused to resolve itself. Inside the café, Jeanne Godet looked up from behind the counter, a towel still in her hand, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. A few customers sat dispersed, a pair of elderly men playing dominoes by the window, and a woman alone at the far, hand stirring a coffee she hadn't touched. She's been here since midday, Jean said softly, nodding toward the woman. Maigret glanced over without turning his head. The woman had a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, her coat draped on the bench beside her. Her expression was unreadable, her features thin and pale. She sat with her hands around the cup, unmoving. "She hasn't ordered anything since then?" he asked. "No, just the one coffee. I tried to ask if she needed something else. She barely looked at me." Maigret set down his hat and coat, then approached the table slowly, quietly, as he would a skittish animal. "Pardon, madame," he said gently. "May I join you for a moment?" The woman looked up. Her eyes were a pale grey blue, the kind that never quite settled on a point. She didn't answer, but after a brief hesitation, she nodded. Maigret sat opposite her. "I'm Chief Inspector Maigret," he said. A pause. "I know," she replied. Her voice was soft, low. He couldn't yet place the accent, but it wasn't Parisian, somewhere farther north, Flemish perhaps, tempered by years of silence. "Have we met?" he asked. "No. But I know who you are." Her fingers moved slowly around the rim of the cup. "Your name." She took a breath, looked at the window as though measuring whether to say it at all. "Elise Mertens." Maigret's brows rose slightly. "Sister." "Widow," she said. She waited a moment, then added, "René was my husband." The café seemed to go quieter then. The clink of dominoes dulled. Even Jean's movements behind the counter slowed. Maigret looked at the woman across from him, studying her. Not for guilt, not yet, but for shape, for the lines of sorrow, regret, or restraint. Her face held traces of all three. "You've been watching the café?" he asked. "Yes." "For how long?" She hesitated. "Since Monday." "That was the last time you saw him?" She shook her head. "No, I never saw him. I came because I received no postcard." "You were not the recipient of the cards sent to Rue des Martyrs?" "No." She reached into her bag and placed something on the table, a small stack of envelopes tied together with twine, all postmarked from Liège, then Bruges, all addressed to a woman named Elise Mertens in Ghent. They were never long, he never was in words, but they came every week until they stopped. "Did he tell you where he was going?" "No, he never did. He didn't want me to follow him. And yet you did." She looked at Maigret now directly. "I'm not a weak woman, Inspector, but I am alone. And when a man writes to you every week for 2 years and then stops, not gradually, but as if severed, you come looking." Maigret nodded slowly. "What was he running from?" She glanced down at her cup. "Not the law," she said. "Not really." René didn't believe in permanence, not in work, not in people. Even our marriage, and it was never something he could settle into. He came and went. I made peace with it. I thought I had. And yet you still waited. I always waited. Maigret glanced toward the staircase that led to the third floor. He lowered his voice. "There's a cigarette. Stub in his room, lipstick on the filter, not yours." "No." "And a postcard, blank, placed on the desk after his disappearance." She looked puzzled. "He would never leave something blank. That's not like him." "No?" Maigret asked. "No. He may have lied, may have disappeared, but he was never careless." He paused. "You didn't come up the stairs? Elise didn't knock on his door?" She shook her head. "I sat here, I watched. I thought he might come down. He never did. I thought maybe I'd missed him. I waited." He leaned slightly forward. "And what if someone else had been waiting too?" Her mouth tightened. "That man in the gloves, I saw him on Tuesday. He stood by the corner and lit a cigarette he never smoked, I think. I think he knew I was watching." Maigret absorbed this silently. He looked again at her, at the faint smudge beneath her eye, at the unkempt sleeve of her coat, at the way she still hadn't touched the cup of coffee. "You came out of love," he said, "but you stayed out of worry." She didn't respond, only pressed her hands together on the table. He rose slowly, placed his hat under his arm. "I believe he may be dead, Madame Mertens, or he may have made himself disappear more thoroughly than before, but either way, he is not here, and I do not believe he will return." Her eyes glistened, but she blinked the tears away. "I know," she said. He gave a faint nod. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" "I'll return to Ghent. Take the back street when you leave, and don't speak to anyone who follows." She looked startled. "You believe someone might?" "I believe someone already did." He turned to go, then paused. "Why do you think he sent 2 sets of postcards?" She looked at him with a small, sad smile. "Because he needed to believe he hadn't vanished. Not entirely. One version of him for the past, one for the memory of what he could have been." Maigret left the café quietly, his pipe cold between his teeth, the drizzle still falling. Paris was a city of secrets, of gestures half-made and sentences left unfinished. René Mertens, or Jean Villers, or whatever name he wore last, had tried to disappear. And yet, like all men who wished to vanish, he had left something behind. And now, Elise had found it. Whether it was grief or peace or simply the truth, Maigret could not yet tell. But the café no longer felt like a place waiting for a ghost, only for the rain to stop. The next morning, the sun managed to appear, not triumphantly but tentatively, as if unsure whether it had been missed. The streets of Montmartre glistened with the residue of rain, and above the rooftops the sky was a pale blue veil, thin and changeable. Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres just before 9. Coat open, pipe unlit, hat in hand. The concierge at the front desk gave him a brief nod, already distracted by a deliveryman arguing over a misrouted parcel. In his office, Maigret found a note on his desk in the firm handwriting of Inspector Lognon. Spotted. Woman matching description. Of Elise Mertens boarding train to Ghent Gare du Nord, 0712. Alone, no tail observed. Maigret read the note twice, then tucked it into the top drawer. He was not surprised. Elise had done exactly what she had promised. She had not lingered, but the lingering wasn't her burden. It was his. He lit his pipe and stared out the window. On the opposite bank, a barge was moving slowly up the Seine. A man leaned lazily against the railing, tossing bread crusts to a line of trailing gulls. For Maigret, The questions had shifted again. Not who René Mertens had been. That mystery had yielded enough to make peace with his outline. But who had followed him? And why had the apartment remained untouched since the final traces? The cigarette stub, the postcard, the matchbook. Someone had been there. But not to kill, not to steal. Only to watch, or to wait. He walked down the hall to the records bureau. Madame Lapointe was already sorting files, her spectacles sliding down her nose. "Do we have anything on Leclerc yet?" he asked. She pointed to a slim folder atop the inbox. Maigret flipped it open. The details were sparse. Belgian national. No confirmed employment. Occasional translation work. Travel between Brussels and Paris. Last listed address. A rented room near Place Clichy. Now vacated. Inside the file, however, was a small detail that caught his attention. Leclerc had once been suspected of involvement in a minor blackmail ring. Unproven, quickly dropped, but the circumstances were familiar. He had followed a man across 2 cities, gathered letters, fragments, hints of indiscretion. Nothing. Criminal, but just enough to threaten reputation. Maigret held the folder open in his hand as he returned to his office. He sat slowly, letting his weight settle into the creaking chair. Blackmail. That was something René Mertens would never have admitted to himself. But it explained the blank postcard, the sudden disappearance, the cigarette with lipstick. Not Elise's. Perhaps René had been followed. Not out of vengeance, but business. Perhaps the man in gloves had not been a pursuer in the criminal sense, but a collector. Someone waiting for the right moment to cash in on secrets. He returned to the Café du Midi that afternoon. Jean Godet, seeing him step through the door, said nothing but poured his usual coffee. "She's gone," Jean said. "I know. I watched the station platform. Did she tell you everything?" Maigret gave a slight smile. "I don't think she told me anything she hadn't already decided I could hear." Jean nodded thoughtfully. She was kind, but quiet. Like she already knew how the story ended. He sipped the coffee, eyes on the staircase in the back. "I need to go up once more." She handed him the key wordlessly. Upstairs the air had shifted again, not in scent, but in feel. The light coming through the window was clear. The desk still sat as it had, the notebook undisturbed, the bed untouched. But now Maigret's attention was drawn to the doorframe. He crouched low and studied the wood near the handle. There, faint but visible in the varnish, were 2 small indentations, scratches recent parallel, as though a key or some metallic instrument had missed the hole twice before slipping in. Someone had entered after he had left, perhaps twice, and had locked the door behind them. The marks were too recent to have been there long. He stood slowly and stepped to the window. The rooftops of Paris stretched ahead, chimneys rising like worn teeth against the sky. A woman across the way was shaking out a cloth from her window. Maigret turned back to the room, and then he noticed it. A folded handkerchief, placed too neatly on the corner of the desk. It hadn't been there before. White linen, no embroidery. Plain, except for a single letter stitched at the hem in grey thread. L. He picked it up carefully, turned it over. A scent lingered, not perfume, but something colder. Soap and cigarette smoke. Masculine, not René's, not Elise's. Leclerc? Or someone else? He replaced the handkerchief gently and sat on the edge of the bed. Everything had been reduced to residue now. Initials, scent, silence. But in Maigret's mind, a shape was forming. Not the shape of a murderer or a thief, but of a final visitor. Someone who had come to confirm a silence. Someone who had come not to end something, but to ensure it had ended. A second knock. The cigarette stub. The blank postcard, left deliberately, as if to say, "It is finished." Maigret rose, opened the wardrobe again. Still empty. Yet at the back, pressed flat against the wall, a business card had slipped between the lining. He pried it out. It was creased and yellowed. Monsieur le Maire, private correspondence, discreet inquiries, and address in Brussels. No phone number. He slipped the card into his coat pocket. He left the room, locking the door behind him. Downstairs, Jean raised an eyebrow. "Anything else?" "Perhaps," Maigret said. "A name. One I hadn't noticed before." She tilted her head, curious. He didn't elaborate. Outside, the rain had stopped again. The street was still wet, but the light was beginning to stretch its way across the roofs. He lit his pipe at last and began walking back toward the quay. The story was not finished, but the telling of it was drawing to a close. And somewhere, in Brussels perhaps, was a man who knew why a quiet life had ended in a silent room above a café, and why the final gesture, a white handkerchief folded with care, said more than any confession ever would. Brussels greeted Maigret with its usual mix of old grandeur and bureaucratic fatigue. The train from Paris had pulled into the Gare du Midi just before noon, under a grey sky that seemed heavier than its Parisian cousin. The city had its own rhythm, slower, more internal, a murmur beneath the cobblestones and chiming trams. Maigret moved through it quietly, his coat buttoned high, his pipe unlit, the business card from Monsieur le Maire pressed between his fingers inside his pocket. He hadn't informed the Belgian authorities of his arrival. There was no case to declare. Not officially. It was a personal errand, perhaps even a sentimental one, the kind of thread no report could justify and no file would record. But still he had come. Something about the quiet room above the café and the small signs left behind, the postcard, the matchbook, the handkerchief, had kept echoing in his thoughts long after the train's whistle had faded behind him. The address on the card led him to a modest side street near the Excels quarter, a mix of tailors, used bookstores, and office windows bearing faded decals that offered translations, notaries, and solutions discreets. It was the kind of street that existed in every European capital, a place where secrets were ferried in silence between envelopes, eye contact was short-lived, and favors were paid for in advance and without receipts. Number 47 was a narrow building, its stucco facade flaking in patches, the doorbell panel a collection of faded names. Monsieur le Maire was handwritten on a strip of yellowed tape beneath the top bell. No first name. Maigret rang once, waited. After a pause, the buzzer gave a flat mechanical groan, and he pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with old dust and floor polish. He climbed the narrow staircase slowly, passing doors with no numbers and closed shutters. On the second floor landing, one door stood ajar. A voice called from within, "Entrez, monsieur." Maigret entered. The office was small, no more than 2 rooms, a waiting area with 2 wooden chairs and a pot of dried flowers, and a larger space beyond, with a desk, filing cabinets, and an armchair that sagged in the middle. Behind the desk sat a man of indeterminate age, neither young nor quite old. His face was smooth, his hands too still, and his shirt too perfectly pressed. He rose as Maigret entered, his smile polite but unreadable. "Inspector Maigret," he said. "I expected you." "You did?" "I received a telephone call yesterday from a woman, French, said you might be paying me a visit." Maigret's eyebrows lifted. "Elise Mertens?" Le Maire nodded once. "She said very little, but enough to suggest you were not coming on official business." Maigret sat in the armchair, which gave slightly beneath him. "You provide correspondence services," Maigret said. Lemaire smiled faintly. And discretion. That is what the card says, no? Maigret withdrew the card and laid it on the desk between them. You knew René Mertens. I did. Not closely. He came to me last autumn, said he needed a way to communicate without return, postcards, letters, messages not to be answered. And you helped him. For a fee, of course. Did he say why? Lemaire studied him. Men like Mertens don't explain. They suggest. They gesture. I understood that he wanted to create two versions of himself, one for the woman in Ghent and one for another in Paris. Did he name her? No, and I didn't ask, but he gave me addresses. I was to send alternate cards, never repeating an image. He supplied the messages. Sometimes he dictated them. Other times he handed them to me already written. Maigret exhaled slowly through his nose. And the final card? There wasn't one, Lemaire said. Not from him, but another man came last week. Said Mertens had left. He instructed me to send one last postcard. Blank, just the image, nothing more. Who was he? I don't know his name. He had a soft voice, wore gloves. Maigret didn't speak for a moment. Why did you agree? Lemaire shrugged. Because I am not a policeman, and because I believed Mertens was already gone one way or another. Gone how? Lemaire looked past him toward the window. There are men who flee justice, others who flee guilt, and some who flee love. I never knew which kind he was, but he paid in cash, was never rude, and never asked to be followed. Maigret leaned forward slightly. What was your impression of him? Lemaire thought for a moment. He was not afraid of dying, he said, but he was afraid of being remembered incorrectly. Maigret stood. He looked at the desk. Tiddy, impersonal. Then at the cabinet. No names, no labels, only drawers. Did you keep any copies of the messages? No. Photographs? No. Maigret reached for his coat. If he is dead, he said, who gains? Lemaire gave a tired smile. Sometimes, monsieur, no one gains. A man vanishes not to erase a crime, but because he believes the world has no more need of him. Maigret stepped into the corridor. Thank you, he said. If I return to Paris with more questions, you will find me here. Outside, the drizzle had returned, thin, barely audible. Maigret walked to the end of the block, paused under a shop awning, and lit his pipe. Across the street, two boys argued over a football while a cyclist passed, head bent low against the mist. The conversation with Lemaire had given him no revelation, no confession, but that wasn't what he had expected. Not from this case, not from this kind of man. René Mertens, or Villers, or the version of himself he had tried to sustain in postcards and silence, had not committed a crime Maigret could name. But still something had unraveled, a thread had snapped somewhere behind the curtain, and a man had stepped in to close the scene. A gloved man, soft-spoken, with no name. Perhaps he was real, perhaps not. But Maigret now understood that the quiet room above the café had not been a place of refuge. It had been a waiting room, a threshold, and someone, not Elise, not Jeanne, not Maigret, had decided when it was time to close the door behind him. When Maigret returned to Paris, the city had already begun to forget the rain. The streets were damp, but no longer reflective, and the usual flow of late commuters, delivery carts, and café waiters moved with a certain rhythm again. There was something about returning from Brussels, a city that carried its quietness, too close to the surface, that made Paris seem louder by comparison, less hesitant in its shadows. He did not go straight to the Quai des Orfèvres. Instead, he walked to Rue Custine one final time. Not because he expected to find anything new, but because there was a part of the story still clinging to the stairwell, to the shape of the room, to the smell of faded smoke and floor wax and damp wood. The story had passed beyond the reach of arrests and charges. It was not about guilt anymore, but understanding. Maigret could not name the crime, but he could name the silence. Jeanne Gaudet looked up from her usual post behind the counter. Her expression said everything. She hadn't expected to see him again, but she was not surprised. Some cases, she had once told him, are like old wallpaper. You don't notice the pattern until it starts to peel. Still nothing? She asked. No. Did you find the man who wore the gloves? I found someone who knew him. That's not the same. She poured him a cup without asking. The room's still as it was, she said. I haven't let it. Couldn't bring myself to. I'd like to go up just once more. She handed him the key silently. Upstairs the air felt cooler. The room had no heat of its own, and now, without a body to hold warmth, it had begun to feel not abandoned, but settled, like something had finished its task, like someone had tidied up before closing the door for the last time. Maigret entered slowly, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him. Everything was as he remembered, the brown blanket smoothed over the bed, the desk neat, the wastebasket empty. But his eyes, sharpened by distance, caught something he had missed before. The baseboard behind the desk had a thin seam, not enough to suggest a compartment, but enough to catch a sliver of dust. He knelt, ran his fingers along it. A faint give. He pressed more firmly. The wood shifted. It wasn't a drawer, just a space, a pocket carved long ago, perhaps for wiring, perhaps by someone long since forgotten. But inside it now were three envelopes, yellowed, unsealed, stacked together. He drew them out carefully, sat at the desk, and opened the first. The letter was addressed simply. Élise Maigret read it slowly. I don't expect you to forgive me for my absence, or for the way I come and go, even in words. But I want you to know that I think of you. Not in the way young men think of love, but in the way people think of shelter. I could never stay, I could only visit, and even that was too much. There is a man who watches me now. I don't know what he wants. Perhaps only a silence. I've given so many, what's one more? If this is the last card you don't receive, know that I meant for it to be blank. Maigret folded the letter carefully. The second was addressed to no one, unsigned, unclaimed. It was shorter. To whoever comes after, I have no enemies, only regrets. If there is something owed, it is not money. If there is something stolen, it is not yours. I lived alone because I couldn't bear to be someone in front of others, but I leave nothing worth hiding, only the absence of a man. The third envelope was thicker, inside a set of pages, pages written in a slightly different hand, shakier, possibly written at night, more confessional. Maigret read them in silence. They spoke of a man who had once worked in offices where letters were dictated but never signed, where translations passed between languages like rumors, passed between strangers. They spoke of a decision, never named, made years ago in another city, involving papers, names, and the kind of choice that reshapes a life without ever being punishable in court. At the center of it, Maigret understood, was not treason, not crime, but betrayal of self. René Mertens had not disappeared to escape justice. He had disappeared because he no longer trusted the man he had become. Maigret replaced the letters in the envelopes. He didn't take them. They belonged to someone else now, or to no one. He stood slowly, looked around the room one last time. The chair, the bed, the dust motes floating in the afternoon light. Nothing more to ask, nothing more to wait for. Downstairs, Jean Godet looked up as he handed back the key. "I'll collect my report," he said, "but no one will file it. You believe he's dead?" "I believe he chose to stop being seen. Whether that's death, I don't know." She looked toward the staircase. "I keep thinking I'll hear him again, just a cough or the creak of the bed." Maigret nodded. "You won't," he said. She poured him another cup anyway. They drank in silence as the café filled slowly, with the soft noise of the evening. Two men laughed at a small joke. Someone played with sugar cubes. Life, persistent, indifferent, moved forward. When Maigret rose to go, Jean asked, "Do you ever stop thinking about them? The ones who vanish without a reason?" "No," he said, "but I stopped chasing them." Outside the light had dimmed, and a wind had picked up. Leaves skittered across the pavement. The shutters on the top floor were closed now, tight, proper. Maigret turned his collar up and walked toward the station. The case had no file number, but in his mind it would stay filed nonetheless, under a category he never spoke aloud: the ones who left quietly. 3 days passed. The file was never opened. There were no charges to pursue, no evidence to process, no testimony to be recorded in the registry at the Palais de Justice. The letters Maigret had found were left in the room above the café, carefully refolded, returned to the hollow behind the desk panel, not hidden, but preserved. He made no copies. There was no need. In his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, the rhythm of police work resumed with its usual indifference. A pickpocket on the boulevard Haussmann, a baker's apprentice accused of theft by a suspicious employer, a domestic dispute in Montparnasse. The kind of days Maigret knew better than most, small lives unraveling in familiar ways, all clamoring for resolution. But even as the noise resumed, a part of his thoughts remained on Rue Custine, in that unremarkable room with the wool blanket, the untouched desk, and the scent of forgotten paper. It was late in the day when Inspector Lognon appeared in the doorway, coat already on, hair damp from a brief storm. "They closed the file on Leclerc," he said, voice low. "Apparently he was seen boarding a ferry at Calais, false passport, but no outstanding warrants. No follow-up requested." Maigret nodded. "Let it go." "You think he's connected?" "I think he was the shadow that arrived after the man had already left." Lognon hesitated, then stepped farther into the office. He looked tired, slightly bewildered. "Do you ever feel like we arrive after the crime has already been erased?" Maigret allowed a faint smile. "Not every crime is made for us to solve. Some are personal. They end in whispers." Lognon scratched at the back of his neck, then handed over a brown envelope. "This came for you." There was no return address. Postmarked from Bruges. Maigret opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of plain paper, folded once. No salutation, just a short paragraph in a tight, deliberate hand. "I have not died. I have only ended what remained. Thank you for not calling me back." Below it, a signature, R.M. No address, no request. Only the statement. Maigret read it twice, then folded the paper and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. Lognon looked at him, puzzled. "From the man?" "Yes." "You going to follow up?" "No." Lognon nodded slowly, then turned to go. "Beer? Later? Maybe." When Maigret was alone again, he poured himself a small glass of the cold white wine he kept hidden behind the third drawer. It wasn't official policy, but then again, neither was the case. He thought of Elise, the way she had sat in the café, unmoving, her hands clasped around a cup of coffee she never drank. He thought of Jean, and how she had paused before answering even the simplest of questions, not out of guilt, but because she had sensed something had passed through her world, quiet and final, like the last light slipping out of a shuttered room. Maigret thought too of the men who disappeared without ever truly running, who faded not out of fear, but out of fatigue. The kind of disappearance that wasn't an act of cowardice or escape, but something simpler, sadder. A surrender. That night he walked home slowly. The city was calm again. Paris in autumn always carried a softness, even when the wind rose. He stopped by the bookseller near the corner of the Rue Saint-Louis and exchanged a wordless nod with the proprietor who was closing the stall. When he arrived at the apartment, Madame Maigret was peeling apples in the kitchen, the radio playing faintly in the background. "You're home late," she said, not looking up. "Yes." "Nothing." "Urgent?" "No, nothing now." She handed him a plate with 2 warm apple slices dusted with sugar. He sat at the table, watching the slow steam curl from the plate. She finally turned toward him. "It was one of the quiet ones, wasn't it?" He nodded. "Did you find the answer?" He thought for a moment, chewing slowly. "No," he said, "but I found the question." She smiled softly, returned to the apples. They didn't speak again that evening. Later, in bed, Maigret listened to the faint ticking of the clock beside the wardrobe. The city outside was hushed, the wind turning the last of the leaves along the boulevard. He thought of the shuttered window on the 3rd floor of the café, the empty desk, the folded handkerchief with its single-stitched letter, the final, unsent postcards, the things people left behind, not out of negligence but because they had no more use for them, because perhaps they hoped someone would find them and understand. But understanding was never a promise, only an attempt. In the dark, Maigret closed his eyes, and in the morning, the first rain of November would begin again. But for now, in the silence between heartbeats, the weight of quiet things settled into place and remained.